November 1918. The German Empire, once the most formidable military power on Earth, stood on the brink of complete collapse. Revolution consumed its cities. Its armies, though still on foreign soil, were disintegrating. The Kaiser would soon flee into exile. Yet less than 12 months before this catastrophe, Germany had seemed poised for victory. Russia was defeated. Vast territories in Eastern Europe belonged to the Central Powers. German forces outnumbered the exhausted British and French in the West. So what went wrong? How did Germany transform from near victor to vanquished in less than a year? When war erupted in August 1914, the German Imperial Army was unmatched. Its officer corps was the envy of Europe. Its organization and discipline were legendary. Its industrial base could supply modern warfare on an unprecedented scale. 4 years later, that same army would be forced to accept humiliating peace terms, and revolution would sweep away the monarchy that had ruled Germany for nearly 50 years. Understanding Germany's defeat requires more than simply counting soldiers and bullets. Yes, the Allies eventually held numerical advantages. Yes, given enough time, their superior resources would likely prevail. But history doesn't follow predetermined scripts, and circumstances are never equal. Germany's opportunity for swift victory evaporated in September 1914 when French forces halted the German advance at the Marne. But even after that failure, the Central Powers weren't necessarily doomed. They might have negotiated acceptable terms, avoided total catastrophe. As one historian observed, after 1914, outright German victory became impossible. But it took extraordinary blunders to transform stalemate into absolute defeat. Both sides made brilliant and terrible decisions throughout the war. But Germany, as the weaker coalition fighting stronger enemies, controlled only its own choices. And as the dominant partner among the Central Powers, German decisions shaped the entire war effort. That's why we focus on Berlin's mistakes to understand the disaster of 1918. The Schlieffen Plan represented Germany's best hope, a strategy designed to overcome superior enemy numbers through speed and audacity. But as the great Prussian general Helmuth von Moltke once warned, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. German commanders in 1914 learned this lesson brutally. They pushed exhausted soldiers beyond human endurance. They expected miracles from mortal men. They neglected supply lines and made critical errors in execution. Combined with desperate, effective French resistance at the Marne, these failures guaranteed the war would drag on. Worse still, Germany pulled Britain into the conflict by invading neutral Belgium. The gamble had failed spectacularly. France survived. Britain entered the war. The Central Powers now faced the nightmare scenario, a prolonged conflict against economically superior enemies. Yet even then, total defeat wasn't inevitable. Some historians argue that skillful strategy might have secured a negotiated settlement even against stronger opponents. If only Germany had avoided the cascade of mistakes that followed between 1914 and 1917. Consider the litany of strategic failures. After the setbacks of 1914, German high command never developed a coherent vision for victory or acceptable peace terms. Precious manpower was squandered in the futile Verdun campaign and through disastrous defensive tactics at the Somme during 1916. Germany's agricultural system collapsed under Allied blockade pressure, leaving the population starving. Alliance management was abysmal. Austria-Hungary and Germany often pursued contradictory strategies, and Emperor Karl even attempted secret peace negotiations behind Berlin's back. Germany's governance system proved dysfunctional. The Kaiser held constitutional authority but lacked strength, while the military eventually seized power but had no understanding of economics or diplomacy. Perhaps most catastrophically, Unrestricted submarine warfare resumed in 1917, failing to starve Britain while bringing America into the war. Germany did achieve successes, certainly. Working with Austria-Hungary, they crushed Russia and Serbia in 1915, obliterated Romania in 1916, and smashed Italy at Caporetto in 1917. Despite limited resources, German industry produced staggering quantities of weapons. German chemists developed synthetic fertilizer production. Ottoman Turkey and Bulgaria joined the Central Powers.
The Allies made plenty of mistakes, too. Wasteful offensives in Lorraine and East Prussia in 1914, the Gallipoli disaster and failed Champagne attacks in 1915, the Somme bloodbath in 1916, and catastrophes at the Chemin des Dames and in the Kerensky offensive during 1917. The crucial difference? As the weaker power in an attritional war, Germany had no margin for error. Every mistake brought defeat closer. The Allies could absorb setbacks. Their path to victory, especially after America joined in 1917, remained clear. Meanwhile, German military leadership privately admitted by late 1916 that they couldn't defeat the Western Allies on the battlefield. So, Germany failed to win quickly in 1914, then watched its prospects deteriorate through cumulative errors in subsequent years. But then fortune smiled one last time. The Bolshevik Revolution in late 1917 offered Germany an unexpected lifeline. Perhaps, just perhaps, defeat could still be avoided. Germany gambled again. December 1917 brought an armistice between the Central Powers and Bolshevik Russia, eventually formalized in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918. With Russia eliminated, Germany controlled enormous territories in Eastern Europe. American forces hadn't yet arrived in France in significant numbers. Berlin had one final opportunity to influence the war's outcome. As German divisions transferred from east to west in early 1918, the High Command prepared one more desperate gamble. Many Allied leaders feared the worst. British Cabinet Secretary Maurice Hankey recorded General John Duquesne's nightmare scenario: the French army shattered and separated from British forces, Germany demanding all Channel ports as peace terms, and if Britain refused, the remorseless hammering of our army by the whole German army, potentially resulting in 1 million British prisoners in France. Some Germans questioned what these coming offensives could actually achieve. Social Democrat Philip Scheidemann asked, "Suppose we captured Calais and Paris. Suppose this breakthrough succeeded completely. Would that bring peace? We've overrun entire nations, driven hostile governments into exile, and still there's no peace." But most Germans clung to hope. Victory might still be possible. March 21, 1918, the German army launched Operation Michael, the so-called Kaiser's battle against the British Fifth Army. Over 70 divisions, supported by 6,500 guns, smashed into 34 British divisions, attempting to split the Allied armies apart. German forces drove the British back in retreat. They captured 75,000 prisoners. They achieved advances unprecedented in the West since 1914. Ludendorff explained his flexible approach. "In Russia, we always set intermediate objectives, then decided where to go next." By April 5th, however, the German advance had stalled. The British, reinforced by French reserves, stabilized their lines. The German High Command launched successive follow-up attacks against both British and French sectors. Operation Georgette in April, Blücher York in May, Gneisenau in June, and Friedensturm in July. These desperate offensives all created serious dents in Allied defenses, but they failed to capture strategically vital objectives. They didn't force Britain and France to negotiate. The Western Front wasn't Russia. The Allies pooled their reserves and stabilized the situation under General Ferdinand Foch's unified command. Then the French counterattacked in July, beginning to turn the tide permanently. The British followed with their own assault on August 8th, a day Ludendorff would call the Black Day of the German army. From that point forward, the Allies advanced relentlessly during the Hundred Days Offensive. The German army, though still resisting, was a broken force. Meanwhile, the Allies crushed the Ottomans, Bulgarians, and Austro-Hungarians in the war's final phase. Even if Germany somehow held in the west, it couldn't defend its south and southeastern approaches. In October, Ludendorff told Berlin to request an armistice. The war was lost. Fighting ceased on November 11, 1918. So what happened during that critical period? Why didn't General Duquesne's feared German victory materialize? Why instead did Germany suffer clear, unambiguous military defeat? The German offensives from March through July shattered their own army without achieving decisive victory. March and April alone cost 280,000 German casualties. By July's end, that figure reached 977,000, with the killed and wounded disproportionately drawn from Germany's finest units, including the elite stormtroopers. One German soldier, Friedrich Meisel, described the carnage. French cells exploded around us, leaving twisted human forms in agony. Our advance stopped, and soon French drum fire engulfed us. Gas and flying steel filled the air. I reached for my gas mask and discovered in horror the shrapnel had torn a huge hole through it. I felt like a cornered animal. I leapt at a wounded man I'd just bandaged and ripped his gas mask from his face. The last thing I saw before putting that mask on were his pleading eyes. Germany needed 200,000 replacements monthly, but only received 70,000 recovered wounded, plus roughly 25,000 new recruits each month. Overall, German strength collapsed from 5.1 million men in March to just 4 million 6 months later. Meanwhile, Allied strength grew, even without Russia. Britain released home reserves. Nearly 2 million Americans reached France by year's end. Even though American combat contributions remained limited, their presence mattered enormously. German rifle strength had exceeded the Allies, 1.57 million to 1.35 million in April. By November, only 866,000 German rifles faced 1.49 million Allied. German commanders constantly shifted priorities as each offensive lost momentum. Capturing rail hubs like Amiens or Hazebrouck could have crippled Allied logistics. Major Wilhelm von Lieb criticized the Army High Command. OHL has changed directions repeatedly, making decisions based on territorial gains rather than operational objectives. Germany had developed effective stormtrooper infantry tactics and revolutionary artillery methods thanks to George Burgmüller, but they couldn't translate tactical innovation into strategic victory. The Allies conversely adapted and cooperated. When German offensive threatened Allied positions, the British government released home reserves. Americans who'd insisted on maintaining an independent army agreed to temporarily loan divisions to the French and British. France transferred forces to help Britain stop Operation Michael. Douglas Haig, who'd resisted French command, agreed to serve under General Foch as Supreme Allied Commander. The Allies proved superior at the most modern form of warfare, combined arms operations using industrial weapons at mass scale. Germany had invented much of this new military technology, poison gas, flamethrowers, and more. But the Allies beat Germans at their own game.
Allied advantages were staggering. 800 tanks versus about 20 German tanks, 4,500 aircraft versus 3,700, 18,000 artillery pieces versus 14,000, and 100,000 motor vehicles for supply versus only 30,000 German vehicles. France alone produced roughly 50% more aircraft than Germany in 1918, matched German heavy artillery quality, and surpassed Germany in tractor-pulled artillery and available ammunition per battery. As historian David Stevenson summarized, the Allies won the technological race, overtaking their enemies not just in numbers, but in combat power. They pioneered the characteristic forms of later 20th century warfare. Although the German army was beaten, it still fought in fall 1918, and Allied planners fully expected the war to continue into 1919. Instead, Germany suffered a catastrophic morale collapse that ended the war sooner. Even before the spring offensives began, many German troops had lost hope. This only intensified as 1918 progressed. Up to 180,000 German soldiers deserted while traveling to France or during home leave in 1918. When advancing, some infamously stopped to plunder Allied supplies. They also began attacking their own supply trains for food. British intelligence noticed the change through prisoner interrogations. Officers and men widely believed Germany cannot win the war. After the offensives failed, surrenders became commonplace. Groups, sometimes entire units at once. This wave of surrenders accelerated until the November 11th armistice, as the army slowly disintegrated. In just the final 3 months of war, nearly 400,000 German troops surrendered. By some estimates, almost as many French soldiers as had surrendered during the entire war. Many rank-and-file soldiers became convinced that continued fighting served only the interests of the High Command, the monarchy, and war profiteers, the so-called Schwindler. The main thing is stopping the Schwindel and the killing. We don't care whether we end up German or French. Others surrendered more readily because they felt disoriented after units suffered such heavy losses that cohesion and group loyalty dissolved. The army suffered a nominal loss rate of 140% in just over 8 months. If a unit had 1,000 men in January 1918, by October, including all new recruits and replacements, a total of 1,400 men had been wounded. Commanders often merged remnants of depleted units rather than properly rebuilding them with replacements. Unit cohesion suffered even more because the military regime shuttled hundreds of thousands of men between the field army and industrial work as short-term priorities constantly shifted. Meanwhile, soldiers, sailors, and civilians inside Germany had reached their breaking point. Workers suffering malnutrition and war exhaustion went on strike. Navy sailors mutinied rather than sail out for a final suicide mission against the superior Royal Navy. Public anger turned against the Kaiser and military leadership. A full revolution in early November forced Wilhelm to abdicate and flee to the Netherlands. Meanwhile, the Allies renewed home front propaganda efforts, better managed relations with labor unions, and exploited the morale boost from American troopships arriving in France to ensure even fragile allies like Italy held firm. Millions of Germans, military and civilian, still wanted to keep fighting, but millions did not. And that tipped the balance. As crisis deepened, Germany's top generals first insisted victory was imminent, then panicked and admitted defeat, a cycle they repeated multiple times in the war's second half. In mid-August, Ludendorff and Hindenburg informed the Kaiser and Chancellor Georg von Hertling that Germany couldn't win the war. Ludendorff then reversed himself. But after Bulgaria's collapse in late September, he announced on October 3rd that Berlin must seek an armistice immediately. The war was irretrievably lost. He also told Hindenburg he had no confidence in the troops whom he viewed had been infected by socialism. German High Command had led the army into disastrous offensives, then undermined remaining morale by suddenly admitting defeat. As historian David Stevenson concluded, the German army, despite its skill, was failed by its generals. So 1918 saw Germany defeated militarily and suffering general morale collapse, but it also witnessed the failure of German wartime politics. From 1916 onward, the German military established an informal dictatorship. They proved terrible at governing. Different German elite factions struggled to give the war coherent meaning. None succeeded. Army High Command saw no political solution and insisted on military superiority until too late to avoid defeat. The Kaiser in High Command clung to maximalist war aims at the cost of potentially effective strategy. They insisted on annexing Belgium, Luxembourg, and parts of France until summer 1918. Ludendorff and Hindenburg even forced Foreign Minister Richard von Kuhlmann to resign when he suggested the war couldn't be decided by military means alone. These rigid objectives conflicted with allies like Austria-Hungary, who desperately wanted peace starting in 1916. The Allies coordinated far better, aligning positions on Alsace-Lorraine, Austria-Hungary's breakup, and the League of Nations, although some consensus would fracture after the war. Although Germany won in the east during 1918, High Command kept hundreds of thousands of troops occupying conquered territories, leaving fewer resources for the Western campaign. In the chaos of former Russian territories, German authorities couldn't even extract needed food from conquered lands, despite the so-called bread peace with the new Ukrainian state. These policies contradicted most ordinary Germans' desire for peace, like this soldier in fall 1918. Why didn't we send a peace note when our offensives had their greatest success? No, now when we're taking it on the chin, they want peace again, just like December 1916. On the home front, military leadership consistently relied on coercion against strikers and unhappy citizens. When Chancellor Hertling told Ludendorff about brewing unrest in September, the Quartermaster General simply replied that more repression was needed. Austria-Hungary did the same, constantly hunting for disloyal Slavs, executing thousands of Ukrainian citizens on suspicion of Russian sympathies, and deploying 7 divisions internally to control roaming deserters. Germany also failed to support its allies during 1918 crises. Austria-Hungary suffered extreme hunger in its Austrian territories, but what little food the Central Powers obtained from Ukraine went mostly to Germany. Ludendorff famously suffered a breakdown when the Bulgarian front collapsed because by gambling everything on the West and maintaining large Eastern occupation forces, Germany had nothing left to support Austria in Italy or Bulgaria in the Balkans. The Allies, conversely, had flawed but more legitimate and representative leaders who better reflected frontline soldiers and factory workers. President Wilson's message that the war was a crusade for democracy proved more effective as a result. They also used naval domination and good relations with neutrals like the United States, until 1917, and Argentina to feed and fund the war effort, supporting Italy and France through their worst economic and military crises. The German Empire waged war of risks from 1914 to 1918, a war ending in bitter defeat. Berlin took these risks because it was the weaker side, but none could prevent total defeat. The final spring 1918 gamble ultimately failed. High Command lacked strategic goals, the army was beaten in the field by a superior enemy, the generals admitted defeat, and other Central Powers collapsed. The home front collapse did help end the war, but given the army was beaten, retreating, and disintegrating due to poor morale, there was no stab in the back, as Ludendorff and the Nazis later claimed. That myth, however, would convince many Germans they'd never truly lost, with deadly consequences for the next World War. In 1945, the Allies didn't stop before German borders to avoid 1918's mistakes. The story of how World War I ended shaped how World War II would end. The lessons learned from Germany's 1918 collapse, both real and imagined, would haunt Europe for decades. Understanding why Germany lost in 1918 isn't just about understanding one war's end. It's about understanding how nations collapse, how empires fall, and how the myths we tell ourselves about defeat can be more dangerous than defeat itself. Germany in 1918 was undone by strategic overreach, tactical exhaustion, alliance mismanagement, political dysfunction, and ultimately by a loss of faith in the war's purpose. The strongest army in the world in 1914 became a hollow shell by 1918, not because soldiers lacked courage, but because leadership lacked wisdom. The walls of Verdun, the trenches of the Somme, the spring offensives of 1918 each represented moments where Germany gambled everything and lost more than it could afford. By November 1918, there was nothing left to gamble. When the armistice was signed, Germany's army was still on foreign soil, still holding defensive lines, but it was a mirage. The real German army, the one that had marched to war in 1914 with confidence and power, had died somewhere in the mud of France, victim of its own ambitions and its leaders' miscalculations.